Let's think about the verdict on communism from the perspective of the intellectual class. In its favour, you have full employment, good quality education, general literacy, particular strengths in things like mathematics and engineering. Some of the downsides, you basically have no social sciences whatsoever. There's a general parochialism whereby people are not looking at international standards. Poor healthcare and some of the consequences of the failure of the economic system more generally. It's also important to understand the cultural impact of communism. Culture reflected an escape of the intelligentsia. Many intellectuals went into an internal exile, avoiding politically sensitive topics and indulging in culture instead. That's quoting Anders Aslund, who's pointing out that when we look at the triumphs of cultural achievements in the Soviet Union and broadly more speaking communist nations, we can see some of that as a downside, reflecting this internal exile rather than a tribute to the regime. One of my favourite literary accounts of the Berlin Wall is The Legend of the Berlin Wall as Presented by a Mole, which was part of a book called A Guided Tour Through the Museum of Communism, published in 2011 by Slavenka Drakulic. The classic spy thriller that reveals the emotional burden of the wall is John le Carré's breakthrough novel, The Spy Who Came In From the Cold. The book itself is obviously very good, so is the 1965 film version. The fall of the Berlin Wall was obviously the monumental episode in the collapse of communism. There's a long history about what was happening, and you can look in various documentaries to understand. I think the reason why the Berlin Wall came down when it did was because of the question posed by a man that I've met on one occasion, Daniel Johnson. He was a journalist at the time and asked the question about when the new command was going to come into effect. The person giving the press conference obviously hadn't prepared well in advance and wasn't sure when this conviction was going to be coming into effect. The end of the Soviet Union happened on December the 8th, 1991. Boris Yeltsin couldn't replace Gorbachev as head of the USSR, and he couldn't dissolve the USSR himself, so he created the Commonwealth of Independent States. This was Russia alongside Ukraine and Belarus, which effectively removed the country from underneath Gorbachev, legitimately replacing him. It also retained a semblance of Russian primacy within this new virtual empire. We can see the collapse of communism as being a peaceful revolution. Over 200 million people went from living in a communist system to capitalism. At the time, there was a surprising absence of civil disorder. In 1956, 1970, 1976, 1990, there were price rises that led to riots in Poland. 44 workers were killed in Gdansk in 1970 after a 36% increase in meat, bread, milk, and egg prices. In 1976, bread and milk prices rose by 60%. There was a massacre in the Soviet Union due to price increases in 1962. And yet, to quote Anders Aslund, to great positive surprise, no single post-communist price liberalization aroused social unrest. According to Pfeffer, the collapse, when it came, was rapid, spectacular, and relatively bloodless. According to Mason, remarkably, with that lone exception of Romania, all other East European revolutions occurred peacefully. Never before in history had so many countries undergone revolutionary changes in such a short time and with little violence. Following the collapse of communism, we then saw subsequent colour revolutions. These were when fraudulent elections prompted revolutions to replace existing governments. Again, these were done with little violence and typically in respect of constitutions. These were relatively peaceful transitions of power. November 2003 was the Rose Revolution in Georgia. November 2004, the Orange Revolution in Ukraine. March 2005, the Tulip Revolution in Kyrgyz Republic. The collapse of communism and the dissolution of the Soviet Union, though, do need to be kept as separate events. So whilst the dissolution of the Soviet Union was quite peaceful, the collapse of communism did lead to some regional bloodshed. In Yugoslavia, approximately 100,000 deaths and 2 million people displaced. In Armenia and Azerbaijan, there's also civil wars in Tajikistan and Georgia, and violent succession in Georgia, Moldova, and Chechnya. The greatest post-communist violence occurred in Romania, where over 1,100 people died 493 of whom in Bucharest. The breakup of Yugoslavia in the 1990s led to long wars costing some 200,000 lives. By comparison, the end of the Soviet Empire was remarkably peaceful. The dominant concern was that the collapse would be peaceful and that the Soviet Union could avoid the bloody civil war that befell Yugoslavia. It really was quite remarkable that the so-called evil empire ended in just 15 years. Both in 1990 and 2003, Russia was a middle-income country. Countries in that income range are typically democracies that are rough around the edges, if they're democracies at all. Their governments suffer from corruption, and their press is almost never entirely free. Most have also quite high income inequality, concentrated corporate ownership, and turbulent macroeconomic performance. But according to Andrei Schleifer and Daniel Treisman, in these regards, Russia was quite normal. Conventional wisdom in the West says that post-Cold War Russia has been a disastrous failure. The facts, they say, writing in 2005, say otherwise. Aspects of Russia's performance over the last decade may have been disappointing, but the notion that the country went through an economic cataclysm and political relapse was wrong. It was more a comment on the overblown expectations than on Russia's actual experience. Compared to other countries at a similar level of economic and political development, Russia looks more like the norm than the exception. Schleifer and Treisman's argument was that Russia's once all-powerful Communist Party no longer penetrates all aspects of social life, nor sentenced dissidences to Arctic labour camps. Instead, it campaigns for seats in parliament. As of 2005, Russia had become a normal country with an incredible absence of civil disorder. This resulted in a $1.4 trillion peace dividend, which meant that money that was being used in an arms race with an enemy could be used for other projects. Don't forget, socialism failed miserably. The USSR needed 3 times as many inputs to get the same level of output, and the quality was lower. Real GNP was never even half that of the USA, and their population was far higher. East German workers would work 3 to 10 times longer for similar goods to West Germans. Health declined. Around 60% of East German industrial base could be written off as being scrap. Evidence suggests that in 1989, the typical Russian spent 40 to 68 hours a month standing in line. By April 1991, less than 1 to 8 people surveyed had recently seen meat in a store. And in winter 1991, Russia had 2 months of grain left and shops were empty. We can understand how corruption became endemic. In the book Putin's People by Catherine Belton, she explains it in great detail. She says the Soviet economy was being drained by resources, by the push to build up military production and compete with the West at the expense of everything else. The communist state was, in theory, succeeding in delivering its socialist vow of providing all workers with free education and healthcare, but in practice the planned economy simply didn't work. Instead, there was a corrupted system under which the ordinary people in the communist state were supposed to protect lived largely in poverty. The communist state could access plenty of natural resources for corrupt trading schemes, but failed to develop light industry to produce competitive consumer goods. There was no private ownership, or even any understanding of what profit was. Instead, the government handed down production quotas to each and every enterprise, controlled earnings and fixed prices for everything. There was no motivation for anyone. The system just didn't work. Consumer goods prices were fixed at incredibly low levels, and because of this, there was acute shortages of everything, from bread, sausages, other foodstuffs, to cars, televisions, refrigerators, even apartments. The shortages meant queues and rationing, sometimes for months on end. Informal connections and payoffs to officials were often the only way to jump week-long queues for the most basic necessities. For shoe repairs, for hospital bed, coffins, for funeral rites, the overweening power of the Soviet bureaucracy had built corruption deep into the system, while under these conditions, the black market flourished. That was how corruption became endemic. Russian problems were enormous. In 1960, life expectancy was 67 years. By 1980, it had fallen to 62. By 2000, after transition, it had fallen even further to 60. What happened to life expectancy in Russia? Well, studies suggest that around 50% is unexplained, but we can put some of it down to other factors. Elizabeth Brainard and David Cutler say around 25% of that fall in life expectancy was due to stress. In other words, fear about low incomes. This only really rose after 1993, so not with the start of the collapse of communism itself, but after transition had already begun. But this concern about low incomes explains maybe 25% of the phenomenon. 25% is probably explained by alcohol consumption. So while there was practically no increase in mortality among children in any age, there was a clear problem in terms of adults. They rule out poverty or food shortages as being a contributing factor, but they say of the 50% that we can explain, half is down to stress, half is down to alcohol. It's important to notice, though, that the change in alcohol consumption is relative to Gorbachev's reforms. Gorbachev made some major policy changes to try to reduce drinking. And to some extent, what we saw was an increase in alcohol consumption from that base rather than an increase in alcohol consumption above normal levels. Maybe what we see here, the contributing factor to life expectancy, is a reflection of loosening Gorbachev's restrictions rather than more people wanting to drink because of transition. Also, focusing on Russia misses the story a little bit. Russia does stand out from other countries in terms of this negative impact on life expectancy. Typically, high income growth coincides with lower death rates. Russia is an outlier for this. When we look at a graph looking at what happened to life expectancy in a number of countries, of course, from 1960 to 2000 in the United States, life expectancy steadily increased. In Poland, life expectancy increases quite noticeably after the collapse of communism. In Russia, there's a slightly different story, which is that life expectancy had already been falling prior to transition. So communism was calling life expectancy to fall. It then started to rise under Gorbachev, and life expectancy goes up, partly because of his major clampdown on alcohol consumption. And then once Gorbachev leaves, we see it collapse as shock therapy begins. 1993 to 1998, though, which was when most of the economic reforms were taking place, life expectancy begins to rise again. So there's an interesting narrative when it comes to those Russian figures that are different from other countries in the region, but also the narrative is to say that the major decline was happening before the economic transition was fully underway. There were lots of real problems that existed. Factories were using valuable raw materials, such as timber, but then producing unvalued furniture. Workers in those socially wasteful factories were worse off as a result of the factories closing. But that was the whole point of transition. The economy was readjusting to try to find value-creating activity. It was a waste of resources, not only in the raw materials, but also in the labor, to be turning valuable timber into unvalued furniture. Of course, if we had perfect knowledge about which factories were profitable and productive before transition took place, then transition wouldn't have been necessary. We simply didn't know at the time where the value was within the economy. The three key challenges faced at the time were, firstly, to establish the institutions of a democratic state, secondly, to flip a communist economy into a capitalist one, and thirdly, to redefine national identity. Recently, we're seeing lots of attention to nationalistic policy. We also know that there's been major struggles at establishing the rule of law and the institutions of democracy. But one thing I want to make very clear is that in terms of trying to move from a communist to a capitalist economy, we have a pretty good track record of being able to deliver this. Eastern Europe and Central Europe are actually very strong examples of the capabilities of changing economic system, even though other elements of our political economic structure may be harder to change and also, of course, are important. It's really easy to underestimate the scale of the problem at the dawn of transition. At the dawn of transition, we have no alternative supply networks. We have bankrupt public finances, which are being funded through hyperinflation. We have negative value-added production. Entrepreneurs, the heartbeat of a capitalist society, are outside the formal economy. There's great distrust between policymakers and the general public, and there's established interest groups that are committed to rent seeking. We have bureaucrats that want to obstruct reforms because they want to protect their own positions of power and authority and are threatened by change. We also have opportunistic business people that want to obstruct reforms because they want to take advantage of the arbitrage opportunities and to establish control of privatization. This alliance of bureaucrats and business people are preventing an open, competitive market economy from flourishing. Vlad Tarko summarizes Mises when he talks about the fundamental problems of transition. And these are, we need to understand how and why capitalism works. We need to understand why socialism didn't work. We need to understand why advanced welfare systems require high levels of existing wealth. We need to understand the historic process why this came about. We need to understand the causes and the dangers of inflation. We need to understand the importance of foreign investment as a mechanism for economic convergence and the institutional foundations for development to be able to occur. And then finally, we need to understand how to engage in economic reforms when the public lacks intuitions about economic policy and, of course, major distrust from their policymakers. These problems are large. Those problems were relatively successfully achieved. I mentioned rent seeking, which is the socially costly pursuit of wealth transfers. And I want to make a distinction between rents and profit. In a market economy, profit is the reward that you receive for entrepreneurial behavior. Profit is the difference between the value you create and the costs of production. Profit is what entrepreneurs are motivated by trying to achieve. Profit participate in this profit and loss signal that tells us where resources need to be made. However, rents are when profit has already been created, but then people are competing in order to be able to obtain that existing wealth. I think it's fairly obvious that most of the wealth that Bill Gates has is from profitable activity. It's also obvious that most of the wealth that Vladimir Putin has is through rents, through the confiscation of existing profitable activity. Now, there can be a blurred middle ground. My favorite example is Ken Lewis, who was the CEO of Bank of America during the global financial crisis. In 2007, he earned $24.8 million in total compensation, whilst his company was being bailed out by American taxpayers. Now, Ken Lewis looks like he's a business person in the private sector. It looks like that's a capitalistic system. I would argue that Ken Lewis's wealth is probably more akin to Vladimir Putin's wealth than to Bill Gates. So even though he's a business person participating in the private sector provisionally, there's also a major lack of competition. He's not really in competition with the private sector. He also has privileged access to state institutions, and there's no obvious link between the activities being undertaken and the wealth creation taking place. So whilst Ken Lewis might be in this kind of middle ground, is it profit or is it rent seeking? Then I would like to make it very clear that when we're talking about transition, those opportunities for rent seeking are massive, and those rent seeking opportunities are detrimental to the functioning of the economy. So how could we engage in rent seeking during transition? Prices were fixed domestically, but traded at market rates abroad. Raw materials such as grain could be imported through subsidized prices, but then sold as finished goods at market rates. It was also possible to obtain credit from the state at a fixed interest rate, despite inflation being incredibly high. Direct subsidies from the government constituted around 10% of Russian GDP in 1992. This was not a system that was favouring entrepreneurs that were finding better ways to create value for consumers. This is a system that favours insiders who have access to the institutions of the state to direct resources. According to Anders Aslund, the more partial and slower the reforms were, the greater the distortion and the larger the rents. The most prominent source of rent-seeking in the public mind was privatisation, but rent-seeking peaked in 1992 when privatisation had barely started. Perhaps the two key steps to prevent rent-seeking are firstly, market liberalisation, and secondly, financial stabilisation. Why market liberalisation? Well, we need world prices to reduce arbitrage opportunities. We need to allow entry by new entrepreneurs, to create competition for the larger established firms, and to simplify the regulations to reduce insider connections and bribes. Why financial stabilisation? Because we need positive market-based interest rates and hard budget constraints to end subsidised financing. Despite all of these problems and challenges engaged in transition, there was a strong consensus amongst economists on the direction that was required. Ultimately, regardless of local culture or history, there's very few ways for people to live with peace and prosperity. Good economic policy is quite simple. Private property rights to generate incentives, a reliable legal framework to correct externalities and constrain predation, a stable monetary system to help maximize information, and free trade in the embrace of markets. Economists understand that we can't have centrally planned economies delivering advanced material well-being. We need to have a capitalist society, the bedrock of which is private property rights. So everybody agrees on the direction of travel. It wasn't a debate about whether we can reform socialism. It was obvious that socialism has failed and we want to move to a capitalist society. The debate was about the speed of transition. In transition, timing is everything, and the debate was whether we wanted a quick transition, known as shock therapy, or a slower transition, known as gradualism. Different factors contributed to the choice over reforms. So different countries have different legacies of history and different geography. For example, the pre-communist history of some countries was more important for others. The degree of reform commitment by leaders was important. The public service mentality was more likely to opt for rapid reform, and self-interested insiders were opting for gradualism. And also external influences and incentives. So the potential for EU membership can play an important role in whether or not gradualism or shock therapy is an option. I think a key point, though, is that the gradual program was not a reasonable, viable alternative to rapid transition. As William Lloyd Garrison famously said, gradualism in theory is perpetuity in practice. Some were arguing that market liberalisation should follow the creation of market institutions. So the UN Commission for Europe was saying you need to build the market institutions before you can liberalise the marketplace. But the countries that moved slowly in liberalising were even slower at institution building. Ultimately, there were two types of people who advocated gradualism: those who wanted slow reforms and those who wanted no reforms. Oleg Havevtushin says the proclamations of the political elites in these countries that the society was not ready for the market and a gradual evolution was necessary were not sincere proclamations, but masked a hidden agenda. How can we tell the difference between people blocking reforms because they want them to be slower or because they don't want them at all? Yegor Gaidar, the economic advisor in Russia, was very clear about the importance of speed. He said, there were no reserves to ease the hardships that would be caused by setting the economic mechanism into motion. Putting off liberalisation of the economy until the slow structural reforms could be enacted was impossible. 2 or 3 more months of such passivity would have had economic and political catastrophe, total collapse, and a civil war. He said there simply wasn't time to wait. There'd also been many previous attempts at reform. So 1917 is the Russian Revolution and the advent of communism. Already by 1921, the Russian economy was on verge of collapse, so Lenin launched the new economic policy, which runs from 1921 to 1928. This was the privatization of small farms and the ability to sell off surplus production. Some people say, well, this was the point at which we realized it wasn't actually communism because these private elements were still allowed. Well, they were still allowed, but that was because communism was tried, and within a few years it was about to fail so dramatically that they had to allow some elements of private production. Still had state ownership of the commanding heights, though, so it was socialist in the sense that you had public ownership of the means of production. Stalin reversed this anyway with his comprehensive central planning. In 1932, he increased the quota that Ukrainian farms had to supply to the Soviet state by 44%, forcing them into collective farms, and 5 million people starved to death. In 1957, we have Khrushchev's Svornarkoz. In 1965, we have Brezhnev's Kozygin. And then 1985 to 1991, we have Gorbachev's perestroika. Now, these reforms are a part of a long-standing pattern to try to fix the system, all of which had previously failed. Advocating further reforms to try to make a gradual change and fix the system we're within was simply not credible. So we can consider Gorbachev's failed reforms, and there were two types of reform that Gorbachev had attempted. The first, glasnost, this roughly translates as openness. It's the freedom of speech, assembly, travel. It involved the right to leave the country. And ultimately, this is what brought down, with the Berlin Wall and the dissolution of the USSR, was people's willingness to vote with their feet and demonstrate that the system had to keep you prisoner in order to maintain itself. Second reform was perestroika. This is loosely translated as restructuring. It allowed greater freedoms for enterprise directors, although there was still state ownership and arbitrary targets as opposed to market prices. According to Ed Dolan, limited enterprise autonomy without profits, prices, or private property proved to be a toxic mix. Managers did use their freedoms to acquire new equipment and hire new workers. In principle, enterprises were supposed to cover increased expenses from their revenues. But in practice, however, the financial shortfalls were papered over with government subsidies or easy loans from state lenders. Some demand rose for machinery and raw materials, but their prices remained constrained, leading to shortages of producer goods. Increased competition for labour pushed up household incomes, but rising incomes and fixed prices led to shortages. Together, inflexible prices, meagre gains in output, and debt-financed growth of demand led to repressed inflation on a colossal scale. So these attempts to open things up were failing on the grounds of the fact that the system itself was fundamentally unsound. Note, though, that not everybody was pessimistic. Many Central and East European countries were actually quite optimistic about perestroika. Central and Eastern people demonstrated in surveys that they were fairly optimistic that the economic situation, would improve in 5 years after perestroika had been announced. Some of the key issues that needed addressing with transition. How do we control budget deficits and reduce inflation? How soon should market liberalisation proceed? Should institutional development precede market liberalisation? And how transparent should privatisation be? Jeffrey Sachs claims to have written the first attempt to create a strategy and timetable for dismantling a centrally planned economy and its replacement with a market economy. That was published in 1989. It was called The Summary of the Proposed Economic Programme of Solidarity. Jeffrey Sachs's focus was on Poland at that time, and there were some significant problems in Poland at the end of the 1980s. Massive shortages in retail outlets, widespread fears of hunger in the cities. Many people thought Poland would descend into civil war, and real fears of a Soviet crackdown, given the long history of aborted reform. Jeffrey Sachs responded to this. The key message he gave, he said, "I urged the Solidarity leadership to abandon visions of market socialism and to go for a market capitalist economy." Some of the reasons why such radical transition is necessary are the fact that the state institutions were the reason for the problem, so they can't really be part of the solution. Comprehensive restructuring is required. Mart Laar, who was the Estonian Prime Minister, said, "That window of opportunity does not last long. It quickly gives way to the more mundane politics of contending parties and interest groups, which is normal in established democracies." His famous quote on how to deal with the difficulties of transition, "Goodbye Lenin, and just do it." This is often known as shock therapy. The term shock therapy, though, is somewhat misleading. When electroconvulsive therapy is used in a psychiatric setting, it is to provide relief. Shock therapy originated as a prelude to medical treatment. It was used on patients suffering mental illness because they were considered to be so far from recovery that they needed a drastic measure to essentially attempt to reset the brain and provide the basis on which the medicine would begin to work. Shock therapy in a psychiatric sense was an intervention to precede the treatment. Shock therapy is never intended to be a cure or a solution. So notice that the economic policies being discussed in Central and Eastern Europe, these weren't intended to shock the economy. They were not intended to provide a basis for market reforms. The collapse of communism was the shock. The shock had already been administered. The economic policies were intended to rebuild it. These were the profit cure. Even critics of shock therapy recognize this order of events. Pfeffer says the Hungarian finance minister Lajos Bokros didn't implement an equivalent package of shock therapy reforms until 1995, after the economy was already in a tailspin. What we typically think of as the shock therapy program occurs after these economies were in major shock, major crisis. It's also interesting to know the role of the West. Many countries wanted to move faster than Western institutions suggested. For example, the IMF is hardly an institution wedded to shock therapy driving these radical, drastic transitions. Olivier Blanchard argued that rapid liberalisation could backfire because Soviet supply chains would be disrupted and a free market would be too slow to provide new ones. And that may seem to be a sensible point to make, but this is a criticism of shock therapy, an argument in favour of gradualism. Blanchard was the chief economist at the IMF from 2008 to 2015, demonstrates that IMF thinking is hardly wedded to radical transition. Indeed, the so-called Washington consensus was pragmatic. It was quite slow-paced. Now, there's no kind of official Washington consensus. It's more of what's known as a retrospective academic construct. It recommended privatization of the large state enterprises to be implemented over a very long period. Over a decade was the standard Washington consensus advice. The IMF, for example, wanted a common currency area. Estonia wanted a currency board. This was a major point of disagreement. Estonia didn't take IMF advice on this. It seemed to work, but it's clear that the IMF were not just driving, and the Washington consensus was not this coherent plan that was forcing countries to do things against their will. I want to challenge this myth of overt Western influence in Central and Eastern Europe at the time. The IMF didn't grant debt relief because they believed that higher future commodity prices would make Russia able to fulfill its obligations. So they provided some liquidity support, but no fundamental solvency actions in helping Russia. Now, also, the Russian government routinely violated the conditions of the loans and only really became fiscally responsible after the 1998 default. In terms of the World Bank's own operations evaluation department, quote, bank advice and lending played a positive but marginal role in the design of policies and in their implementation until 1998. So not a massive amount of IMF and World Bank support in these regimes. In an interview with John Pfeffer, Volen Sidorov, who was a far-right Bulgarian politician, cited Joseph Stiglitz as an influence for his views on globalization. So this is an important point because it demonstrates the danger of the myth of overt Western influence. The fact that Western advisors believe the claims that people like Joseph Stiglitz made about how the World Bank and IMF dominated these reform programs has been a key factor in the backlash against these globalist international organizations and prompted far right. To some extent, the rise of the far right is a function of the perceived failure of transition and liberal capitalism more generally. Correcting the myth of overt Western influence will allow people to make their decisions on factual grounds, not based on myths and conspiracy theories. In the book I published with Paul Dragos Alejica in 2009, The Neoliberal Revolution in Eastern Europe, we confronted some myths about Central and Eastern European transition. We did 4 major myths. 1. The main source of the spread of economic ideas came from the West. And we said no. The genuinely radical economic ideas came from within Central and Eastern Europe. Why do we say that? The first country to adopt a flat tax was Estonia. We saw Western academics travelling to Eastern Europe not just to consult on what they should do in their reform plans, but also to learn about how many countries were adopting reforms much, much more radical than were taking place in other countries. Second myth is that the economic ideas were adopted and remained constant throughout the transition process. In reality, we saw that neoclassical economic theory was fundamentally altered in response to the Central and Eastern European experience. So-called new institutionalism was built to augment neoclassical theory and reflect the fact that economists were learning about economic systems during this time. The third myth is that economic ideas applied uniformly across Central and Eastern Europe. However, we believe that there was significant local mutation. In Romania, we did a case study of a new blend of religious economics that was an important factor in the Romanian evolutionary story. The fourth myth is that the economic ideas being adopted were indeed neoliberal, as opposed to the mainstream orthodoxy of the time. So we looked at examples of genuine market fundamentalism and found that they were not part of the transition process. The economic ideas that Eastern European countries were adopting were part of the mainstream of the economics profession. The concept of market failure is part of mainstream economics, and those who advocated market fundamentalism had much less influence than people who advocated standard neoclassical economics. We also think that this myth of overt Western influence undermines to some extent some of the important stories that came out of Eastern Europe in terms of local leadership. So if we think about different countries, in Poland you have Leszek Balcerowicz, in Czech Republic Václav Klaus, Bulgaria Ivan Kostov, Russia Yegor Gaidar, Kyrgyzstan Ashkar Eshkeyev. Now, were these people just simply following along to what the Western people were telling them to do? We think not. We think that underestimates the amount of agency and the importance of these local leaders at being able to drive reforms for the content-specific situations they were in. Many Western academics acknowledge this. Jeffrey Sachs has acknowledged that Lech Balcerowicz became the leader of Poland's reforms. He acknowledges that Balcerowicz had his own plans, which he'd shown to Sachs, and that Sachs's main role was coordinating the international assistance. It wasn't devising and implementing the plan, it was helping local leaders acquire the Western resources to try and support that plan. Treisman points out that leaders clearly mattered. Had Ukraine's economy in 1992 been overseen by Yegor Gaidar and Russia's by Leonid Kravchuk, short-run outcomes in the two countries would probably have been quite different. Don't underestimate the importance of local leaders. The most important local leader in Central and Eastern Europe during the transition period was Leszek Balcerowicz. We can look at the Balcerowicz plan as the classic blueprint for implementing radical reforms or shock therapy. It's the standard for radical comprehensive reforms. Balcerowicz was the Polish finance minister from 1989 to 1991 and 1997 to 2000. The plan had 4 elements. The first was macroeconomic stabilization. So the plan here was to end hyperinflation through fiscal discipline and sound monetary policy. This involves having to create a new centralized Ministry of Finance and an independent central bank. Also, stabilization requires currency reform to enable trade. Jeffrey Sachs argues The attempt to end high inflation, create a working currency, and end the devastating and intensifying shortages was the key priority. Not privatization, which, as mentioned already, was seen to be something that should subsequently follow. Now, when we look at the success of stabilization, whenever we see GDP growth figures in Central and Eastern Europe during this period, we see a V-shape. We see the fact that when communism collapses and transition begins, we see GDP growth fall and then subsequently rise again. And the question is how quickly that recovers, but also whether we can make meaningful before and after comparisons. Does it make sense to look at countries after communism and before communism and be able to claim whether or not these are like-for-like comparisons? Some of the problems when we look at these growth figures. One, the quality of the numbers are different in these different time periods. The fall in output only occurs in reforming countries because the reforming countries have more accurate figures, according to Andrei Schleifer. So is it the case that we see these declines because these are the more transparent regimes? The official measures of Soviet output were net material product, which isn't directly comparable to gross domestic product. So again, we're not comparing like for like before and after. At a fundamental level, the two different systems are biased in two very different directions. Imagine the Soviet system, you're being paid for what you produce, so your incentive is to overstate how much you've produced. In a Western system, you get taxed based on what you produce, so you're incentivized to underreport how much economic activity you're engaged in. So if we switch from a Soviet to a Western system and we see a decline in economic activity, is that actually a decline in economic activity, or is it a change in the reporting because people all of a sudden don't want to promise that they're doing too much? Official statistics overestimate the health of the Soviet economy in 1989 and probably underestimate it afterwards when lots of black markets are operating, creating economic activity that's not necessarily being reported. Another issue with growth figures is that a reduction in output is good if there's negative added value. We know that Soviet production is inefficient because it's taken highly valuable raw materials and producing consumer goods that consumers don't want. Well, in that case, it's an improvement in welfare if we see a fall in output. Most of the lost output is for the products that had little consumer demand, and therefore this reduction in output is simply one step before restructuring the economy into a direction where the economic exchange is more effective. According to Anders Aslund, a substantial part of the recorded decline, probably half, was not real, but can be explained with mismeasurement, expansions in unregistered economic activity, and the eradication and elimination of value to traction. Also notice there's real disjoint between GDP figures and living standards within a communist regime. We know that retail trade in constant prices rose by about 16% from 1990 to 2002. Final consumption of households rose by about 3% from 1990 to 2002. The number of Russians going abroad as tourists rose from 1.6 million in 1993 to 4.3 million in 2000. This is a strong measure of turnaround and increased living standards as more people are going on holiday. This is a different economic indicator to measure GDP, but reveals something slightly different. We know that the private ownership of cars doubled. The proportion of Russian housing with running water increased from 66% to 73%. The share of Russian houses that had running hot water goes from 51 to 59% during this period. People with central heating, again, 64% to 73%. The proportion of apartments with telephones rose from 30 to 49% from 1990 to 2002. So over that 12-year period immediately after the collapse of communism, regardless of what we're seeing on recorded economic growth, when we're looking at more consumer-based measures of living standards, we're seeing some important increases in those metrics. We also need to be careful when we look at the timings. Most of the fall in Russia's official GDP and also electricity consumption occurred before 1994. This was before mass privatization was completed, certainly long before the really controversial privatization plans that took place. Schleifer and Treisman say Russia's sharp decline in official output came before, not after, the oligarchs emerged on the scene. And these output drops happen across the region. Officially measured output fell in the post-communist economies of Eastern Europe and the former Soviet Union, with no exceptions. It declined in new democracies, such as Russia and Poland, in continuing dictatorships, such as Belarus and Tajikistan, in rapid reformers like Czech Republic and Hungary, also slow reformers like Ukraine and Uzbekistan. The universality of the contraction suggests common causes, according to Schleifer and Treisman. What are those common causes? Probably reductions in military expenditure, and then the dislocations due to the collapse in the planning system. So many people were warning about the fact that the planning system would cause these supply chains to disintegrate, which is obviously one of the consequences of the dissolution of the USSR, and these are things that spread across the entire region. We shouldn't be surprised that output declines. That's not a failure of transition. Again, that's part of the context in which transition is taking place. So the Balshevik plan, step 1, macroeconomic stabilization. Step 2, deregulation. Allow prices to derive from supply and demand. How do we do that? We need to cut subsidies. We need to liberalize trade. We need to break up monopolies. In a world where we have high shortages, free trade, in other words, trade with people overseas, is incredibly important to compensate for the lack of domestic supply of goods and services. Indeed, there's evidence to suggest that already by January 1992, you started to see consumer goods reappearing in stores in Russia as a consequence of prices being freed. Third part of the Balshevik plan, we can think about privatization. Privatization in terms of the ability to start new businesses, but also to sell large businesses from the hands of the state into the private sector. Privatization is a crucial aspect of the transition process because it removes economic resources from the hands of the state and creates the very foundation for a market economy. A 2003 OECD study found overwhelming support for the idea that privatization brings significant increase in the profitability, real output and efficiency of privatized companies. In Central and Eastern Europe, we see one of the biggest experiments in privatization of all time, but notice that economists have a very strong consensus that this is an important part of the process. In the first 10 years of transition, lots of privatization occurred. Over 150,000 large and medium enterprises, hundreds of thousands of small firms, millions of apartments. By 1994, about 70% of the Russian economy had gone into private hands. And privatization creates competition within the region. In Central and Eastern Europe, we had 30% of state-owned companies with no competitor, but just 9% of privatized companies with no competitor, and just 5% of new entrants with no competitor. This is how competition takes place. Academic studies suggest that countries with more privatization have more democracy. More privatization means less corruption. Why do rapid reforms help reduce corruption? Well, it simplifies government regulations, reduces the arbitrary power of bureaucrats, and restricts monopolization. Now, privatization and liberalization need to work together. In the case of Russia, we may see lots of examples of privatization, but perhaps without as much liberalization. Oleg Havrushin says Russia's poor economic performance of this decade, he's writing this in 2020, the huge income distribution gaps, the formation of fabulously wealthy oligarchs with a nouveau russe, a tendency to ostentation, was attributed to market reforms, when in fact a more correct assessment would have been these failures resulted from too little reform. His claim is that there was a big increase in private ownership, but not the accompanying competition and liberalization that the Balshevik plan proposes. Some reformers thought that privatization might be enough, and even if it was botched, privatization is good because it creates the demand for legal protection. So this is a kind of Coase theorem view, where the key thing is that we allocate assets and then we allow markets to redistribute those assets to their highest value use. The downside of this, though, the problem, is that capitalists would probably rather protect their own assets, and maybe through bribes, through corruption, than lobby for the rule of law and for all assets to be protected. Maybe a bit naive to think that capitalists, once given property rights, are going to be in the position where they want and demand respect for property rights as a system rather than their own self-interest. Willem Buter says, Coase theorem only applies efficiency if property right institutions exist, and of course the context of the time was that those institutions didn't exist. So we can say privatization needs to be accompanied by competition, but also we can't rely on capitalists to bring about capitalism. Oligarchs can improve the functioning of firms, but we shouldn't expect them to improve the functioning of the market as a whole. We have learned some lessons about privatization. Privatization tends to be better when it's done with outsiders rather than insiders. Foreign investment can help. Transparency is important. And also the creation of new enterprises is as important as changing the ownership structure of existing ones. I think a main learning outcome is this need to combine privatization with competition. Again, Halvorsen says, the creation of monopoly power unrestrained by market competition led to a vicious cycle of partial reforms as the new capitalists used their political influence to make very difficult entry by new competition to enhance their monopoly power. If we have monopolies, it's typically a sign of a lack of competition and therefore insufficient, incomplete market reforms. The Institute on Global Markets Survey of Economists surveys economic experts and asks them their views on things such as privatization. And there's an incredibly strong consensus that economists believe privatization raises productivity. It's one of the few things that economists have strong agreement about. When asked the question, on the whole, the shift from state to private ownership of many industrial assets in Central and Eastern European countries after communism has increased productivity, 64% strongly agree, 35% agree, 1% uncertain, no one disagrees, no one strongly disagrees. Strong consensus that the shift to private ownership increases productivity. The fourth part of the Balcerowicz plan, which is often overlooked, is the need for a social safety net. This involves assistance for displaced workers and those who've lost their pensions in hyperinflation. And it also exposes the myth that radical transition leaves people destitute. Having an effective social safety net is an integral part of radical transition plans. Now, this is a kind of pragmatic approach to social welfare. In an interview in 1991, Balcerowicz said, a doctrinaire liberal would probably oppose expanding state social welfare institutions. But I personally think such institutions should exist, as long as their performance is reasonable and their costs don't undermine the whole economic program. So that's the trade-off that's taking place about whether or not there's sufficient funds to be able to engage in a new change in economic systems, as well as ensuring that people don't get left behind. The aim of this transition is to create the growth that means that productivity improves and therefore people benefit through that. Notice, though, that the greatest social pains come not in countries moving quickly on reform, but exactly the contrary, in those moving very gradually. When we're looking at the negative consequences of transition, it tends to be the countries that were doing slower on the reform process where we have the biggest problems. When we think about social security, what we see in this region is not so much a rise in unemployment, but more of a transfer from disemployment to unemployment. People that are doing zero productive jobs, but having a job, moving into registered unemployed. From an economic perspective, this is part of the purpose of transition, which is moving people into the jobs that are going to create value and be more consistent with their human capital, their skills, their desires and their motivations. Health expenditure rose in real terms across Central and Eastern Europe, from 4% in 1990 to 6% in 2003. So in Hungary, for example, 8% of GDP is spent on health, Czech Republic 7.5% of GDP, but under 3% was being spent in Georgia, Azerbaijan, Kazakhstan, Kyrgyzstan, Moldova, Tajikistan, Uzbekistan. We saw some radical restructuring of educational systems. So, for example, there were no business studies, there was no economics as a discipline. These were all being built from scratch. And so this is one of the reasons why Westerners played a role, because you're trying to engage a movement from one economic to a system to another in a world where you don't have locally trained economists. University students doubled from 1989 to 1999 in the region. And if anything, perhaps public spending could have impeded transition to some extent. In Russia and Ukraine, for example, 10% of social transfers went to the poorest 20% of the population. You would like to think that those social transfers are designed for the poorest population. So for only 10% of them to actually reach those intended targets implies that there are deeper problems that wouldn't be solved by having more money thrown at them. In Russia, around 70% of social transfers went to the wealthiest 30% of the public. This is revealing the endemic corruption and problems of the socialist economy, and the necessity for quick, comprehensive transition. Now, despite common rotation of office, radical reforms were not unpopular. Indeed, the rotation of office seems to be a kind of good thing because it means that politicians were embracing democracy and the public knew that they had a vote and that vote was leading to meaningful change. New governments, and even some new governments that included former communists, typically contained reform agendas. To quote Anders Aslund, communist parties fared poorly regardless of country and policy. A cross-country regression for post-communist countries shows governments pursuing radical reforms fared better in democratic elections than gradualist governments. He goes on to say an overwhelming majority in 15 post-communist countries thought that reforming their country was too slow. Innis points out that 89% of Czechs supported a market economy. Most believed it was necessary for growth. I think the role of expectations is incredibly important here. In a 2009 survey, less than 10% of Hungarians said they felt that most people are better off than under communism. And yet GDP per person had tripled. How can we reconcile the fact that we know income per person is significantly higher, yet people are saying they don't feel any better off? Well, maybe they're answering a different question. Maybe instead of answering the question, are you better off? Maybe what they're really answering is, are you as well off as you thought you would be? Which is a very different question. And then that comes down to what was your expectation about the transition process? Pfeffer uses data from Hungary and Austria to say that the failure of transition was the fact that Hungary only cut the lead from Austria in half at best. So in 1991, Hungary had 15% the income of Austria. By 2015, Hungary had 54% of the income of Austria. Pfeffer uses that as an example of the failure of transition because Hungary is only half the income of Austria. But this is a dramatic improvement in the relative status of those two countries. From 1991 to 2016, income per person in Austria increased by a factor of 2.1. In Hungary, it increased by a factor of 7.7. So the reason why Hungary didn't make increased roads to Austrian income per person is because Austria was growing during this period as well. But Hungarians are much richer than they were, and they've also dramatically closed the gap with Austria. It seems a bit odd to think that we require Austrians' incomes to flatline or even fall to be able to judge Hungarian transition a success. On average, per capita GDP in Central and Eastern Europe exceeds pre-transition levels by 40%. So in simple income per person terms, transition has been a dramatic success. The fact that Western European countries have continued to grow in this period is not a sign of failure of transition. It reinforces the fact that economic institutions of prosperity, of capitalism, are incredibly important because these growth continues over time. Perhaps people were looking at examples of countries that have achieved some rapid growth. Ireland in 1973, Portugal in 1986 were at the starting period of rapid instances of growth, typically tied to joining the European Community or the EU. This involved direct Marshall Plan subsidies that intended to use accession as a means to achieve economic parity with existing member states. The aim was that Irish income per person would broadly be level with the Western European average at the time. However, was it reasonable to expect that all of these Central and Eastern European countries that were leaving the legacy of communism would be able to do the same thing that Ireland and Portugal saw, where they have such dramatic transition as a consequence of joining the EU, large-scale development programs? Pfeffer says, in the 1990s, the sheer number of potential new members knocking on Europe's door put a strain on the EU's coffers. Well, the EU wasn't doing much anyway to try to promise those countries they would have the type of support that would allow them to replicate those massive catch-up success stories. The Economist is well aware of this reform paradox. To quote the Economist newspaper, this highlights one of the biggest paradoxes of post-communist politics. Privatization, stabilization, liberalisation and flat taxes have stoked prosperity in every country that has adopted them. Slow and partial reforms do not work. Fast and deep ones do. Yet voters rarely see it like that. Maybe it's because voters don't have the economic education and training that allows them to understand what are the institutions that develop and cause economic growth. When we're doing this reassessment of what shock therapy means and whether or not it was really applied, we can think of shock therapy in different ways. We can think of it as a rapid end of price controls that allow markets to function and allow trade to flow. This was what Jeffrey Sachs was advocating. We want to dismantle the institutions that are hobbling and not allowing market economic relations to flourish. Some imply that shock therapy is the dismantling of government control over the economy to create a pure free market system. But that wasn't what Sachs advocated. It wasn't what the Bolshevik plan was attempting to deliver. Whether there was some secret experiment taking place or not, we're not sure. But what we do know about shock therapy was that it was an attempt to make Central and Eastern European countries more like a standard capitalist society. The vision was for Poland to become a normal country. It was to become a capitalistic market economy. The experiment was the transition process, not the type of economy that these reformers were attempting to deliver. One important point to recognize, I think, is that you can't take a successful transition for granted. It's therefore more important to ensure you're on the right track than what it is that you're trying to do along the way. The debate really rests on whether we compare the actual experience of transition with a hypothetical, idealized reform process or the most likely alternative. We have examples of alternatives because not all countries in Central and Eastern Europe were actually able to engage in a successful transition. Some of them didn't engage in shock therapy. Some of them didn't engage in any form of reforms at all. And we have those as relevant cases to say this is what a counterfactual history might look like. We don't need to compare Poland, for example, to a hypothesized gradual reform. We should really compare Poland to somewhere like Belarus that doesn't engage in reforms at all. If we think of the shock therapy countries, maybe Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, Poland, Czech Republic, Slovakia, these might be the rapid transition countries, the countries that had more steady reforms, Hungary, Croatia, Slovenia, countries that engaged in some reforms but then backtracked or aborted reforms, maybe Russia, Bulgaria, Albania, Macedonia, Kyrgyzstan, the countries that adopted the gradual, more institutionally savvy reforms, Romania, Ukraine, Armenia, Azerbaijan, Georgia, Kazakhstan, Tajikistan. And then, of course, we've got the 3 countries that have no reform: Belarus, Turkmenistan, Uzbekistan. Question is, do you want an idealized vision of where Poland and Estonia or Czech Republic might have ended up? Or is the relevant comparison point the other countries in that set and their experiences? Seems to me fairly obvious which of those buckets are the successful outcomes, and the successful outcomes are the ones closer to the European Union, but also the ones that engage in the most comprehensive radical transition towards the types of economy that exist within the European Union. The transition experience in Central and Eastern Europe constitutes a massive triumph of economists. Never before have economists played such an important role in social restructuring. Of 21 communist countries, 18 became market economies. Only 10 of them became democracies. Even fewer adopted the rule of law. This is a success of the economic approach and a failure, perhaps, of the political and the legal attempt to transition. And as Aslan said, market economic reforms have been highly successful, whereas democratization has been partially or particularly auspicious, and the introduction of the rule of law even less so. He says, at present, we seem to understand how to build a market economy. The ignorance of democracy building and the construction of a legal system are all the more striking. Do we want to declare that because we can't build democracy and can't build a sound legal system that we shouldn't try to deliver changes in economic institutions? I don't think that's necessarily following, because the countries that have those negative impacts have made no progress on their economic reforms, and the countries with most progress economically seem to have made most progress on those other factors as well. We simply don't have the luxury of being able to fix those things first because they're so much harder to fix in the first place. It's better to have economic reforms and none of the others than no economic reforms and just stay with the existing systems that we had. This neoliberal project, therefore, wasn't a failure of economic policy at all. It was a failure of the rule of law. It was a failure of democracy building, perhaps. But the economic insights that we learned in order to transition from a socialist economy to a capitalist economy was a triumph of economic sensibility. We can also see this in the fact that the institutional development in the region was lagging behind the economic liberalization. It was the economic liberalization that came first. The fastest institutional evolution tends to occur in the same countries that were the early and fastest liberalizers. We don't have any examples of countries that followed this gradualist recommendation of improving their institutions and then liberalizing the economy. And the reason there's no countries that did that is very telling. The biggest progress in institutional development came from those who liberalized most quickly. The economic liberalization made progress on the institutional level, even though it was difficult to have a complete perfect outcome. Despite initial pessimism about the prospects of establishing liberal democracy, several countries have developed consolidated democratic systems and functioning market economies, with extensive welfare policies and relatively low inequality. The statistical correlation between measures of reform progress and social, democratic, and economic performance is widely accepted to be positive and strong, even more so 3 decades after transition. And countries implementing early and resolute liberalisation of markets, fiscal restraint, and not at all coincidentally democratic reforms had much better economic and social outcomes than those pursuing more gradual strategies. That's to quote Eckert and Havrashen. We tend to think that people in transition are unhappy, considering the challenge of large-scale institutional transformation. The sustained economic growth since the mid to late 1990s suggests that economic transition has largely been a success. However, after adjusting for various country-level and individual-level variables, according to Guriev and Zhuravskaya, transition countries' residents express significantly lower degrees of life satisfaction, and that the average difference between life satisfaction of residents in transition and non-transition countries is robust and large. So this was one of the most important findings in transition economics, which is that people that have undergone transition claim that their life satisfaction is lower. It's very difficult, though, to compare those post-transition countries with what was happening in 1980 to 1985. Of course, we don't have the data of these types of survey pre-transition. People in transition appear to have lower life satisfaction compared to counterparts in other countries with similar per capita incomes, unemployment, inequality, and inflation. And the gap in life satisfaction is particularly large among the elderly. The gap reached its maximum in the middle of the 1990s and seems to have been closing since then. But it does open this question: why is it the case that people in transition are so unhappy? Well, the main reason for the gap is age and also low levels of GDP per capita. So Guriev and Zhuravskaya say, once growth restarts, people in transition countries start to feel better about their lives. Solution to why people are unhappy in transition is to deliver the economic growth that tends to coincide with increased life satisfaction. Their conclusion is the seeming puzzle of abnormally low life satisfaction in transition countries largely disappears once we control for income, age, public goods, inequality, income volatility, and unanticipated changes in the value of human capital. Our results imply that life satisfaction in transition countries will continue to rise conditional on economic growth. So whilst there is some mystery still about why people are unhappy in transition, it does seem to be that the best solution for this is continued economic growth. I think the impact of aspiration might be very relevant. This was a quote from somebody undergoing transition. "I am sure that we will not live like normal people. Our lifetime will not be enough to see the change for the better. Throughout my life, I worked as an engineer, lived in a good 1-bedroom apartment, and was satisfied with my life. But when my brother-in-law went to Israel and told us how he lived there, then we realized that life could be different. He has 2 cars and a house. In our country, only a director of a plant could live like that, certainly not an engineer. Only then I realized how badly we live." The transition process opened up these economies and opened up these countries. It revealed to the people that lived in them what the standards of living were actually like in countries that had capitalist institutions from a much earlier part in their history. One might argue, therefore, that's an argument in favor of capitalist institutions and as quick and as rapid a transition to that as possible. If part of the trauma of transition is a gap between the expectations and the reality, then notice that journalists are contributing to this by focusing on the perceived failures of transition. Of course, the whole purpose of transition, though, was increased transparency. And so this desire for transparency shouldn't be treated as a negative once it reveals the information that people wanted to have. The fact that Russia was more like Argentina or Turkey than the US or Germany is clearly a factor in the wounded pride and disappointment that transformation didn't provide a miracle. But it is the reality, and therefore it's not an argument in favor of returning to the original communist system. Schleifer and Treisman say, "We believe that the exaggerated despair over Russia was fueled by a fundamental and widespread misconception. Many Western observers thought that, as of the early 1990s, Russia was a highly developed, if not wealthy country. Thinking that Russia was highly developed, these observers saw its convergence to the norm for a middle-income country as a disastrous aberration. But all it was doing was revealing the original situation, which was that Russia was a middle-income country. Schleifer and Treisman go on to say, one recent paper, for example, makes the remarkable observation that although institutions to support the rule of law are imperfect in all countries, they quote Joseph Stiglitz, who says, between Russia and most other developed capitalistic societies, there was a qualitative difference. But Schleifer and Treisman say, well, of course there was a qualitative difference. Russia was never a developed capitalist society. The trauma wasn't the fall in living standards per se, but perhaps the confrontation of how poor a country Russia was. It was a sign of damaged pride that was the trauma, not a decline in living standards. The Western world treated Russia as though it was a superpower, but it wasn't, in economic terms, a superpower at all. It was effectively Turkey with nuclear weapons. As soon as we no longer had them as a credible military threat, maybe they deserved the humiliation to realize that they weren't on an economic standing level with America. When we look at empirical studies, we see a very strong link between democracy and market reforms. Countries in Central and Eastern Europe that did the most in terms of developing transition to capitalist economic institutions also did best in increasing democracy and progress in terms of political rights and civil liberties. The so-called shock therapy blueprint, the Balcerowicz plan, worked where it was tried. The countries that had the most radical reforms had the most successful reforms. Where we see examples of policy failures in countries that struggled, in often cases these were either deviations from those economic plans or simply failure to adopt them in the first place. Ultimately, we can't really choose between radical transition and perfect transition. We need to choose between the most likely alternatives. Usually that's a choice between radical reforms or no reforms at all. When we see the progress made by countries in terms of their economic transitions, what we see is that from 1994-95 is a crucial period where the amount of reforms done up until that point pretty much determines where they stand 10 years later. Anders Aslund puts it the following way: the longer the first jump, the farther each country went. The reforms done in 94 to 96 determined the next decade. There's probably a narrow window of opportunity for those reforms to be done, and those countries that seized that opportunity set their futures. Since the fall of communism, we see dramatic increases in life expectancy across Central and Eastern Europe. The beginning of the transition process is visible when we're simply looking at life expectancy. The quicker and more radical the improvement in the economic system, the faster the long-term economic growth. Countries that moved early and advanced farthest had superior socio-economic performance. These are the words of Leszek Balcerowicz and Oleg Havlushin. These are not the words of the IMF or the World Bank. This is not the Washington consensus. This is the Central European consensus. I'll leave you with some final words with an interview with the oldest dog in Bucharest. This is chapter 7 of Draculich's The Guided Tour Through the Museum of Communism. The oldest dog in Bucharest says the following: if you look around, what else can you see besides stray dogs and clogged traffic? You see again old, beautiful, even if decrepit villas being demolished to make room for new buildings of steel and glass, for foreign banks and corporations, like in Shanghai or Singapore, for new masters who no longer rule by fear, but by greed. In the transition from communism to capitalism, all people are unequal, but some are more unequal than others. That's a pessimistic view. But if I was speaking to the oldest dog in Bucharest, I'd say that it may be sad to see these rising, shining buildings made of metal and steel and glass. But why not contrast that to the buildings that rose under communism? For example, the Palace of the Parliament in Bucharest, the world's second largest administrative building that started construction in 1984, where to make room for such a large project, an entire neighbourhood and parts of 3 others were razed to the ground overnight. People received notice in the morning to pack up and leave, and then by noon the bulldozers had arrived to demolish everything in sight. 40,000 people were displaced, 9,000 houses were demolished. Several monuments and churches were destroyed, including a monastery dating back to 1564. That's town planning under communism. Shock therapy may reinforce trauma, but relative alternatives were either not feasible or not desirable. Don't forget that the shock therapy inflicted on this region constituted parts of a transition from one economic to another system to another, which is an incredibly rare example of a relatively peaceful revolution. Compared to the bloodshed involved in the adoption and application of communism, the implementation of capitalism genuinely constitutes an economic and humanitarian success.